Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the ENDI 2013 demonstration debate between two excellent teams of Emory debaters who will be debating for your education and your enjoyment. Your responsibility during this debate will be to flow what is happening in the round. The debaters should hopefully inform you how many sheets of paper you'll need so you can keep track of things. For each speech that they give, they should give good roadmaps. Hopefully they'll be going slow and clear enough that this should be relatively easy to follow. We're also going to implement the lecture that I just gave. You will all be voting on who the winner of this debate is. It is in your hands. Their pride, their self-esteem, nay, their self-worth and value of life is in the hands of your ballot and your decision, so get it right.
No pressure.
You'll be writing a ballot after the debate. You'll be turning it into your labs. You'll have to justify those decisions in your lab. I know for my lab, everyone will have to explain their reasons for decision, and it can't just be Jason talked pretty or Julia sounded nice. It has to be a real, robust reason for decision, and not something that is just made up. So implementing all of these judging practices, trying to put yourself in these debaters' shoes as they go through good examples of the arguments in the packet. Now, by way of introduction, this actually works. No sound, no sound. Your walk-up music is not working, I'm sorry. No, wait. Oh, it is working. On the affirmative team, the first affirmative constructive. Do we have any hoochies in the house? High School, Vicious, Vives, Karathiki, whatever. The second affirmative constructive. Her opponents have been known to only prepare pre-written concession speeches before debates because her two ACs are so devastating. It is Julia, the Mauler Marshall. The Marshall Plan was actually named after her because a time traveler went back and said her plans were so devastating. It's your affirmative team representing lifting the embargo to Cuba, Marshall, and Vives. Ahem. That is a bad reason for decision. An example of a bad reason for decision. On the negative team, we have the first negative constructive. Don't let her small stature fool you. She is a giant of the debate community. It is Paula the Punisher Chang.
Punisher!
And the second negative constructive, hailing from the Woodward Academy and returning from his first round performance as a college debater, like his native country's sweet treat baklava, his style is nutty but also smooth and sweet. He is Jason the Spartan Sigalos. All right, you can start debating now. Everyone flow! Do you know how to timer someone?
Or do you want it? You can use my phone.
You have a timer running for you. You have a timer running for you. Viva slower than the slowest slow time slope gonna be. So, regular.
Plan. The United States federal government should end the economic embargo on Cuba. Advantage 1 is relations. Ending the embargo would expand credibility, U.S. soft power, and improve U.S.-Cuban relations. That's Hindernall in 11. Cuba provided a testing ground for the promotion of American ideals. Obama has the opportunity to highlight the benefits. The United States is ready to engage. Its legitimacy will grow. Perhaps leaders will be more willing to make concessions. The economic costs of the embargo are amplified. By ending the embargo, Obama would indicate that he is willing to extend his hand once America's traditional adversaries unclench their fists. Next, Cuba is the linchpin to Latin American relations. Perez in 10. Examples of U.S. unilateralism have been seized by new generations of populist Latin American leaders who stoke anti-American sentiment. Over 30% of our oil comes from Latin America. A polarization is spreading. It has been a long time since the United States sponsored military action in Latin America. A good reputation can go a long way, which will help the U.S. The U.S. must repair its image. Many problems facing Latin America can be addressed in the absence of U.S. leadership. Cuba is a keystone nation in Latin America. America's reputation has suffered. Obama, if it wants to repair America's image in the region, will have to pass a Cuba litmus test of its own. Warming relations would have reverberated effect throughout Latin America. Next, action now is key. Removing the embargo would boost overall Latin relations. Perez in 10. One of the legacies of the America's Cuba policy is that it isolates the U.S. The opportunity is right. First, is that leadership changes allow signal a new way forward. Second, reforms enacted in Cuba indicate that post-Fidel leadership is more likely to embrace pragmatism. Third, Obama ignores Latin America at its own peril. Addressing it could lead to a high return. Washington must find ways to cooperate. These reasons combine for a perfect storm. The U.S.-Cuban relationship should be pursued with a vigor. Next, Latin American relations are vital to solve proliferation and climate change. Zadillo et al. In 2008. The United States and Latin America have rarely developed a sustained partnership. If a hemispheric partnership remains elusive, the costs will be high. The risks that criminal networks pose will continue. The risks of nuclear proliferation will increase. These countries will lose opportunities. The key challenges faced in such as securing energy, combating and adapting to climate change, and combating organized crime and drug trafficking have become transnational. Washington needs partners. Criminal networks. The threat can only be countered through coordinated efforts. Next, soft power limits the frequency of conflicts. 9 and 96. Leadership is a key factor in limiting the frequency of great power conflicts. The paradox is that the most powerful state is not so powerful that it cannot achieve all of its goals. The U.S. can continue to enable and mobilize international coalitions whether or not the U.S. itself supplies large military forces. This requires sustained attention that make the U.S. leadership effective and joint action possible. Next, proliferation risks nuclear conflict. Inexperienced nations will be more likely to use their nukes. Horowitz, 2009. Nuclear acquisition generates uncertainty. Civil military instability and pressures generated by the requirements to handle responsibility will skew decision-making towards more offensive strategies. Inexperienced operators and the bureaucratic desire to justify the cost spent, and combined with organizational biases that favor escalation, the use it or lose it mindset may cause new nuclear states to adopt riskier loss postures, or at least be perceived that way. Acquiring nuclear weapons would make them more likely to escalate disputes, but their lack of experience could states more likely to select adversaries poorly. In the short term, nuclear proliferation is likely to cause uncertainty about war. Next, warming risks extinction. Tickle in 2008. The idea that we could adopt to a 4 degrees Celsius rise is absurd. Global warming would mean humankind extinction. Collapse of the polar ice caps become inevitable. All the world's coastal plains would be lost. Carrying capacity would be hugely reduced and billions would die. The climate system is experiencing significant feedbacks as the Arctic warms. The release of billions of tons of methane is already underway. The PET maximum may be analogous to the warming caused by human emissions. That influence prevents global nuclear conflicts. Kagan in 2007. Nationalism is back, and American predominance prevents these rivalries from intensifying. With the U.S. to diminish its influence, nations would settle disputes as the greater and lesser powers have done. Wars. One aspect is such that these powers would possess nuclear weapons. It is dangerous to underestimate the role that the United States is providing stability. Conflict would involve struggles. Conflict would disrupt trade flows. The war could erupt between China and Taiwan, Russia, Georgia, India, Pakistan. Conflicts are more likely to erupt if the U.S. weakens from its positions of regional dominance. The alternative to American predominance is not balance and peace. Advantage 2 is human rights. The embargo is destroying human rights in Cuba, denies people access to basic needs, services, and universally agreed upon rights. Call in 2007. The Cuban embargo is not limited to a set of economic sanctions. It is a comprehensive program. The embargo has indiscriminate effects on economic, social, and family conditions that cause us to violate widely recognized human rights norms. The administrations have exerted pressures on foreign governments and companies to discourage all economic contact. Thousands that could trade with Cuba are no longer allowed by the virtue of being subsidiaries to U.S. corporations. The embargo effects on human rights are far-reaching. The restrictions have deprived Cuba of vital access to medicines, medical tech, food, chemical water treatment, and electricity. The disastrous effects have been denounced. The embargo has the opposite effect of harming human rights. Next, the embargo's attempt to abuse human rights is backfire. Removing the embargo would boost human rights and force the regime to stop abusing them and provide the impetus to improve through internal change. Amish in 12. The embargo policy is based off the fact that economic denial will bring about economic failure in Cuba, thereby creating popular dissatisfaction, leading to the destabilization of the regime and its collapse. The sanctions have done little to address violations of human rights in Cuba. The American embargo has not sufficient to democratize Cuba and improve human rights. Continued economic sanctions create no incentive for the Cuban government to promote better human rights. Empirically, the policy does not succeed in promoting democratization. Something more must be done. The prospect for improvement seems as bleak as ever. The United States should lift the embargo on Cuba to work internationally on providing human rights in Cuba. Reopening diplomatic relations will decrease the chances for conflict and promote cooperation. American engagement will provide the impetus in Cuban society to produce regime change. Empirical evidence shows that a strong economy is correlated to democracy. This correlation is a causal link. Economic growth directly leads to democratization. A policy of engagement will long-term solution to promoting democracy and improving human rights. This approach will decrease the hostility between the United States and Cuba. Next, human rights are an absolute good. We must act to protect them in all instances. Human Rights Watch in 1997. Human rights should be protected by the rule of law. People live under the control of tyrants having no recourse but war to relieve intolerable living conditions. Unless some way was found to relieve these people, they could revolt and become a catalyst for a nuclear war. Representatives can come to that conclusion that basic human rights need to be protected to preserve the human race. And next, the survival of species is only possible by respecting human rights. Anas et al. In 2002. An atomic bomb presented the prospect of total annihilation. Preventions must be based on recognition that all humans are the same, rather than emphasis on our differences. The recognition of universal human rights is fundamental to the development of a species consciousness. The idea of a universal human right shares the recognition of a one common humanity and provides a minimum solution to deal with the miseries. Membership is central to the meaning of the enforcement of human rights, and respect for basic human rights is essential to the survival of the human species.
So, what exactly would the United States and Latin America do to solve global warming?
This could be a bunch of different things, including things like cap and trade.
Well, I don't know the policy called a bunch of different things.
Yeah,
I don't know what that does.
There's not a single policy because Latin America and the U.S. have to get together.
So you literally don't know. That evidence
is
from Ernesto Zedillo, who was the former president of Mexico. Doesn't he have an incentive to be like, I'm a really important person?
Institute who wrote reports.
Okay, a think tank. Cool.
Yes.
What are we going to do to solve proliferation?
What are we going to do? And cooperate with Latin America in order to decrease the
what are we going to do with Latin America other than cooperate?
Force them to
what treaty? What will that treaty do?
There's a bunch of different things that Latin America and the U.S. can
I don't know the treaty called a bunch of different things. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not as smart as you and don't know as many things. Oh, okay. All right. Let's move on. So your impact for warming is from a guy named Oliver Tickle. He's British, just like that guy. He says that if there were to happen a 4 degrees Celsius rise, that would kill everybody. How does he know that?
He cites the collapse of things like ice caps, the world's coastal plains eroding.
How does he know that?
He knows
I understand he cites that. How does he know that?
A lot of experts in the report, including
which ones?
Think tanks, like Sir David King.
Oh, he's a knight. Okay. All right, we can move on from there. Let's talk about human rights. So you've read evidence that says the Cuban embargo hurts human rights. Totally on board with that. Makes some sense. What evidence do you have that indicates if we remove the Cuban embargo, human rights abuses would literally stop all over the world?
All human rights abuses would stop. The Kolev says that the restrictions...
Kolev.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I know.
Okay.
I'm getting to this Anas evidence. Your Anas evidence, the article is actually titled Protecting the Endangered Human Toward an International Treaty Prohibiting Cloning and Inheritable Alterations. Do you sign that treaty, which Anas says is necessary to protect human rights?
Anas says is necessary. Anas says
it's the title. It's literally the title of the article.
Sure. The argument is that the collective human consciousness is necessary, i.e., we can't alienate people because of it. We think they're communists.
Okay.
Not the embargo.
So we're not going to alienate communists if we lift the embargo ever again.
Not in the context of Cuba. Our argument is that simply providing medical tech and access to a bunch of things like chemical water treatment and electricity is necessary.
But actually.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what would you do to stop Russia from imprisoning its citizens?
What would we do?
Yeah, it's political dissidents.
Yeah. So
you say lifting the embargo solves human rights.
Yes.
I named it human right abuse.
Consciousness. So when those
it literally changes everybody's consciousness? Sure. Oh, okay.
Ooh.
Had some quality 1AC in, had some quality cross-examining. Jason was able to maybe influence some understandings and get some arguments out there that will help him later in the debate. We'll see how much those questions come into play as the debate goes on. Vivith was able to give some solid responses and stick to the more logical, argumentative style of cross-examination, whereas Jason was maybe being a little more showy for y'all. How many sheets of paper do we have right now? Two sheets of paper. Two. We have two advantages. What are the two advantages? Human rights and Latin American relations. Correct. The first advantage was relations. Second advantage was right. So, for the 1NC, you will need those two sheets of paper, and I'm sure Paula will inform you how many sheets of paper you need for off-case positions. I'm sure she'll give you a very useful order for doing that. A lot of interesting evidence, a lot of interesting arguments in that 1AC. One piece of evidence in particular from Michael Horowitz. I like that evidence. Does someone in my lab know why?
Oh, he came up with
He what?
He came up with the term soft power.
No, that was Joseph Nye.
He was a debater here.
He was a debater at Emory who... He won the national championship. Yes, that makes him qualified. All right. 1NC.
But he did not invent the counterpoint.
No, Klimchak and Tankersley invented the counterpoint.
We'll be okay, Karen. Pull it.
Okay, the order is 2 off. And then the human rights advantage and the relations advantage.
So, 2 new sheets of paper, and then your human rights flow, which was the second sheet, and your relations flow, which was the first sheet. You will need 4 pieces of paper total.
Okay, you guys all good?
Loud and slow.
Alright. The first off-case position is the counterplan text. The United States federal government should close its naval base on Guantanamo Bay and relocate terrorist suspects to federal prisons in the United States. Closing Gitmo solves human rights and relations. That's Perez in 2010. Offering to renegotiate the status of Guantanamo Bay would be a clear demonstration that the U.S. is committed to respecting Cuban sovereignty. Closing Guantanamo would have reverberating effects throughout the world. Guantanamo has come to represent the image of an intolerant, unjust America. The second off is the Cuba democracy dissent. Cuban democracy is emerging organically now. Lifting the embargo would empower the regime. That's Radash in 2013. 10 years ago, there was no access to the internet for anyone in Cuba. It barely existed. And there were no social networking sites to spread the word about repression. Now, bloggers have managed to get past the regime's ban. The main demand they raised is to lift the embargo. According to the argument, lifting the embargo would deprive Fidel and Raul from their main propaganda arguments. And trade and travel from the U.S. would expose Cubans to Americans, help curb anti-Americanism, and lead to slow reform of the system. Lifting the embargo is also the #1 desire of the Cuban communists. If the economic need of the Cuban government is satisfied through lifting the embargo, repression would increase. It would allow for a continuation of the Castro society. If you did an opinion poll among Cuban opposition activists, the majority would be in favor of not lifting the embargo. Cuba is finally on the verge of change. And the Cuban opposition movement is creating a model for economic democracy. Success will spread it globally. That's Harrington in 2013. Trapped by the limited possibilities of this dichotomous capitalism or communism mentality, mainstream commentators lack the perspective needed to appreciate that a transition away from a state-dominated command economy might conceivably lead up to a type of market that is distinct from our model. What sets the Cuban cooperative experiment apart and renders it such an incredible opportunity for the global worker cooperative movement is its occurrence in a political economic milieu that is currently free from the distorting effects of capitalist competition. While cooperatives have proven just as competitive as capitalist firms in a capitalist context. When capitalist profits and growth assume top priority, worker-owned firms may be compelled to act more like capitalist firms and subordinate core objectives such as worker empowerment. No country bears as much promise in this respect as contemporary Cuba. And economic democracy is key to human survival through sustainable degrowth. That's Turnbull in 2013. Economic democracy provides an efficient way for sustaining both humanity and the environment. Economic inequality increases exploitation of the environment to provide luxury. This situation arises because a decrease in the current global population is required to allow both the environment and the existence of humanity to become sustainable. Self-determination had gone too far without sufficient coordination from the central government. Now go to the human rights advantage. 1. Too much, too fast causes instability. Going too fast risks civil war. That's Perez in 2010. Cubans will not wait up to the day after Fidel dies and experience broad-based changes. The Cuban government will have to move slowly. Liberalizing the economy by adopting market reforms would promote growth but could also alienate large segments of the population still enamored by Castro's revolutionary zeal. Reforms are interpreted as a wholesale rejection of the ideological underpinnings that have dominated Cuban discourse for the last 50 years. A poorly managed state-led economic opening can quickly become unmanageable and create instability. A slow and methodical economic transition would be a far more pragmatic approach for the Cuban government. The U.S. should recognize the Cuban government has little choice but to move at a relatively glacial speed and work to make the economic transition as smooth as possible. 2. All causes to human rights abuses, war on terror, and cyber war policies. The plan is not sufficient to solve. That's Greenwald in 2012. Op-eds warned of the precipitous decline of American credibility on matters of human rights. By introducing viruses as Stuxnet and Flame, America has severely undermined its moral and political credibility. Revelations that top officials are targeting people to be assassinated abroad, including American citizens, are only the most recent disturbing proof of how far our nation's violations of human rights has extended. Now go to the relations advantage. 1. Incompatible political views impede relations. Lifting the embargo will not solve. That's Hansen and Lee in 2013. A fundamental incompatibility of political views stands in the way of improving U.S.-Cuban relations, experts say. The most important objective of the Cuban government is to remain in power at all costs, says Martin, an assistant professor. 2. There is no widespread prolife. That's Hyman's in 12. For decades, people have predicted weapons are about to spread. Such warnings have routinely proved wrong. Despite the fusion of technology, the world has been experiencing proliferation slowdown. Nuclear weapons are taking longer and their failure rate is much higher. The key reason is absence of cultures of scientific professionalism, which is a consequence of poorly built political institutions. The quality of technical workmanship is low. There is little coordination across technical teams, and mistakes lead to finger pointing, and these problems cannot be fixed. 3. Warming is irreversible. Consensus of most qualified scientists. That's Ron in 318. An NOAA paper explained climate change is irreversible for 1,000 years. This notion we can reverse climate change by cutting emissions is one of the most commonly held myths. We would need an immediate cut of 70% globally, further cuts over time to stabilize CO2 that would leave us with a 0.8 degrees C warming that assumes no feedbacks kick in. We'd have to drop emissions to 0 now. Even in this implausible scenario, we still aren't talking about reversing climate change. We don't have until 2030s to wait for cuts. The MIT study revealed wait-and-see policies presume climate change can be reversed. GHG emissions are twice the rate of GHG removal. GHG concentrations will continue to rise even if emissions fall. These beliefs, analogous to arguing a bathtub filled faster than it drains will never overflow, violate conservation of matter. 4 is there's no risk of extinction. That's Lomborg and 8. Sea level will rise 18 to 59 centimeters. Tickle is exaggerating by a factor of 400. What will happen beyond that depends much more on emissions in future centuries. To cause billions to die would require the surge to occur within a single lifespan. This scare tactic is wrong. Model evaluates the impacts on agricultural, forestry, ecosystems, coastal zones, deaths, and disease. Benefits from warming outweigh the cost. This is not the end of humanity. 5. Soft power does not solve. Increases resentment for the uncivilized. That's Gray in 2011. It is fallacious to assume that American values are universal. The scope for soft power is limited. If one places weight on soft power, one needs to be alert to ethnocentrism. This breeds an arrogant disdain for evidence of foreigners' lack of interest. The result is military counterreaction. Not all rivalries are resolvable by ideas that seem fair to us. Not all conflicts are amenable of American soft power. 6. U.S. decline will not spark wars. That's McDonald and Parent in 11. The U.S. is ripe to overhaul its military, shift burden to allies, and decrease commitments. Retrenchment need not signal weakness. Fallen hegemons still have formidable capability. They are no longer the target for balancing coalitions and can play a role in alliance formation. They should eliminate burdens without exposing vulnerabilities. Empirical record supports these conclusions. Periods of transition do not appear more conflict-prone. A policy of retrenchment need not undermine U.S. commitments or unleash destabilizing dilemmas. By shifting burdens to allies, the U.S. can strengthen its commitments while accommodating China.
All right, so
We're going to take a few steps to the middle so you're on the camera.
So all of your evidence about Cuban democracy coming now cites that there's this one political blogger who just writes about how Cuba is terrible. Why does that mean that Cuba is now transitioning to a democracy?
Our evidence indicates that this blogger is an example of things like democratic movements that are happening in Cuba now. So they're actually protesting the government. They're beginning to actually have a
No, it's about one person who's protesting the government.
Yeah, it says that there are lots of people, including this one person. It cites this one person as an example. It says there are lots of other bloggers, for example, just like Singh.
So your evidence is about the Global Worker Cooperative. What evidence do you have that says that Cuban's Global Worker Cooperative would spill over and other countries would model?
Well, the second piece of evidence I'd read, which is the Harrington evidence, indicates that we have to look at Cuba to be successful.
What countries are looking at Cuba's economic model right now?
Well, once Cuba is successful at it, other countries in the region...
so Spain right now, your evidence also says that Spain has a workers' cooperative. Why haven't countries modeled Spain if it's so successful?
Because first it needs to see that it can be successful in places like
Latin America. If the workers' cooperative is successful in places like Spain,
if Cuba proves that it's able to be successful and complete a peaceful transition and have
So if it was not successful in Spain, why would it be successful in Cuba?
You need to prove that it's able to be successful in other regions of the world.
Why would it be successful?
Our evidence indicates that in Cuba right now, the demonstrations that are occurring, if the plan does not happen, will be successful in the future.
All right. So the counter plan. How does it solve relations if it's true that you just move all of them to another prison?
The argument is that... Sorry?
Human rights. How does it solve human rights if it's true that you just move all of these prisoners to a different prison?
Our argument is that Guantanamo is a much worse place than the federal prisons that we would move them to.
No, your evidence is about how we treat prisoners badly because we think they're terrorists, and that's a human rights abuse. How does it change if they're moved to a federal prison?
It also says that it changes the image of America, like Guantanamo has this image
what does the image of America have to do with human rights?
As an intolerant and unjust America.
Right, what does that have to do with...
Guantanamo, it's about the perception of other countries, right? So other countries...
What does the perception of other countries have to do with the way that we treat people?
The perception of our human rights credibility now is low because of things like Guantanamo.
The only thing that you can solve is human rights credibility. Am I correct? All right. Another question on the DISAT. If it's true that radical degrowth can solve... How does radical degrowth solve the environment?
The argument is that radical degrowth would not have the same type of capitalist profit.
That's not true. The second piece of evidence that you've read says that there's still a growth motive.
No, it's actually really good. It talks about how there's a distinction between the model that would happen in Cuba. The Global Worker Cooperative has things like profit as well as
so it has things like profit. How would that be sustainable degrowth?
More to things like the environment, and so that they don't only have a profit above all.
How do you relate to the environment?
So they don't think that we should just emit coal or have the most environmentally degrading things because the environment is important as well.
While Julia prepares and gets ready to go or just wanders off, I think we have a few comments about this 1NC. There were 2 off-case positions. Could someone raise their hand and tell me what the first off-case position was? Yes.
The counter plan.
The counter plan. What was the counter plan?
To move all the prisoners from Guantanamo Bay.
Remove all the prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. Close the Guantanamo Bay prison. Can anyone tell me what type of counter plan this is? Yeah.
No, sorry.
Okay, yeah. It's an advantage counter plan. Yes, it's an attempt to resolve the affirmative's advantages. How might it resolve the affirmative's advantages? Yeah, Max.
It solves human rights and relations is the part
Yeah.
Because they don't want Guantanamo Bay there. So it improves relations there, and it improves human rights because Guantanamo Bay itself isn't a human prison.
Yeah, it's a mean prison, so it's bad for human rights, and it's a symbolically bad prison because we've put it in Cuban territory, and it makes people angry that we kind of use a base in Cuba as part of our war on terror efforts. So they've introduced some evidence that it might be a good way to resolve a lot of the issues that the affirmative has said are important. Now, is that a standalone strategy? Can they just go for that at the end of the debate?
Yeah,
Yeah, why do you think so?
because it solves both of their advantages.
It solves both of their advantages, but I think there probably wouldn't be prudent to go for it, because if there's any chance that it doesn't solve one of the advantages, then they have no real offensive argument. So what is the offensive argument that goes along with this counterplan? Yeah. The democracy dissent. Yes, the second off-case position. Does anyone want to take a stab at giving an explanation of what this is? Yeah.
Democracy starts with managing Cuba
Mm-hmm.
and removing the embargo only empower the regime by giving it money.
Would empower the regime by giving it money? What about all this discussion of worker cooperatives? What was that all about? Yeah.
Well, they were talking about how the Cuban opposition models economic democracy, and that economic democracy is key to survival for the future. So we're going to need to growth in order to survive.
Good, yeah. The argument is sort of about how there is a rising democratic momentum in Cuba, which is both good for human rights and means that there will be economic democracy. Does anyone have a good grasp on what they mean by economic democracy in that evidence? Yeah.
The regime were to change, it certainly would no longer control the businesses. So.
The regime itself wouldn't necessarily control the businesses. Yeah, the businesses would be worker-run and worker-controlled. The workers themselves would own the businesses and would direct them in ways that were more beneficial to everyone, might help the environment more, might help themselves more, as opposed to benefiting bureaucrats or elites or leaders. And this dissent says that that's a good thing and that's a good model because it's a way more environmentally sustainable model for development. Why would getting rid of the embargo affect that? What is the link to this dissent? Yeah.
They're saying that getting rid of one argument was that Cuba, like the Cuban regime wants the embargo lifted.
Yeah.
Because there will be an influx of money going into Cuba, which will go to the regime. They can use that to, fund their more oppressive, tactics or whatever. So lifting the embargo will bring in more money, and it would, stifle the opposition's efforts.
Sure, that's definitely one component of the link argument. What's another component about these worker-run businesses? What would the embargo, lifting the embargo, do to these new worker-run businesses? Yeah.
It would spread the U.S.'s sort of capitalist influence onto the workers.
Yeah, the U.S. would have more economic influence in Cuba, and so maybe we'd have businesses that were more our model, which is not a worker-run model, as opposed to that model that's growing in Cuba now, which is a worker-run model. So maybe that division is good, says the negative, because it keeps our way of doing economics and business separate from their way of doing economics and business and lets their way grow, and says that their way is beneficial. What about the case arguments? I think Paula made a pretty good diversity of arguments on both advantages. Was everyone able to follow, and understand what a lot of those arguments were? Okay. I think that was good. I think there were a diversity of arguments on each advantage. One thing I think she maybe could have done slightly differently was include maybe some analytical arguments, some non-carded arguments, as well as all of these good warranted cards. But I think by and large this was a good, robust coverage of the case. So, we'll see what happens in the negative block. Obviously, it kind of depends on what's going down in the 2AC, but I think the negative has some good options right now. They have some defense on the case. They have a counterplan which provides, a hedge against some of the case advantages, and they have a disad which they can go for either with case arguments or with the counterplan at the end of the debate. So they have a diversity of options right now. We'll see how it develops, and we'll see what the 2AC does to respond.
Jason, do you have a normal timer?
Nick was using it.
Do you mind? Okay, so the order will be relations, human rights, the counterplan, and then the dissad.
1AC Advantage 1, the 1AC Advantage 2, the counterplan, then the disad. Has everyone got that all in order?
Anyone not ready? Off of 1NC number 1, the plan resolves the reason why incompatible political views are a problem. The plan would result in economic cooperation and deepen political ties between the Cubans and the Americans that will have a reverberating effect in the Latin American world. That's our Perez evidence, which is much more qualified than their 1NC evidence because he has a JD from Yale and has studied Latin American relations for the past 20 years. Off of 1NC number 2, three arguments. 1. Proliferation causes extinction. Iran and North Korea can get access to nuclear technology via know-how with China and Russia. Second, it doesn't assume the possibility of accidental nuclear war via inexperienced operators. That's our Horowitz evidence, which is also qualified as per Nick's before the round discussion. 3. This evidence commits a logical fallacy. Just because weapons have not spread quickly in the past doesn't mean they couldn't in the future. Off of 1NC number 3, warming is not irreversible. First, there is tons of room to maneuver. We can still buy ourselves time. That's our tickle evidence. Second, their evidence doesn't say what it intends to. It says in the underlying portions that if we can slash emissions, we would be able to avert the worst impacts of warming. That's our tickle evidence. Thirdly, is there's an invisible threshold of CO2 that if we pass, we will have an on-switch to disaster of global warming. We must do everything we can to prevent this. Fourth, they've 100% conceded solvency. So they have conceded that we preserve the carbon sink of the Amazon forest and we would increase CO2. Also, we would result in global agreements to slash CO2 emissions and that Latin America has more CO2 emissions than China, Russia, and India combined. The plan would be huge. Now, off of 1NC number 4, warming causes extinction. 4 arguments. 1, positive feedbacks. That's our tickle evidence. 2, rising temperatures. 3, lack of farmland. And 4, methane bursts. The author of their card is incredibly unqualified. Lomberg, look him up on Google. He's a common global warming denier and has no qualifications. They've also conceded that warming is happening now. That means there's only a risk the affirmative would be able to prevent the worst impacts of warming. Now, concede 1NC number 5. We are not going to go for our soft power impacts. Now, off of 1NC number 6, hegemony solves war. 1, empirical evidence goes affirmative. The past 20 years have been peaceful due to American influence. Second, we only need to win that we prevent the escalations of conflict. That's Kagan. Now go on to human rights. Off of 1NC number 1, 4 arguments. 1, no link. The argument doesn't make any sense. There's no reason or no difference between lifting the embargo slowly or quickly. Second, no link. Their evidence says that prioritizing political reform before economic reform would cause instability. The affirmative does not do that because we do not prioritize political reform or try to usher in a new regime quickly. 3, there is no impact. They did not highlight any impact component of this card. It just says that it may cause instability, but not that instability will happen. 4, none of our impacts are contingent on instability in the region, so I don't know why this is relevant. Now, off of 1NC number 2, no all causes. First, the embargo is key. That's our call evidence. Second is there's no warrant for this. It's just an FYI about what the United States is doing now, but doesn't come to grips with our embargo internal link. Also, they mess up here. They have no terminal impact defense against human rights being the #1 impact. That's our Human Rights Watch evidence. Now go on to the counterplan. 4 arguments. 1, permutation do both. Second, doesn't solve relations. Lifting the embargo is essential to opening diplomatic channels between the U.S. and Latin America. That's our Hinderail card. 3, it doesn't solve human rights. The counterplan doesn't come to grips with the fact that Cubans currently don't have food, electricity, water, or medicine. That's our MASH evidence. Cross-Ex also shows that prisoners would be moved somewhere else, so it doesn't solve the fact that these prisoners are being treated poorly. 4, it doesn't solve hegemony or credibility. The counterplan would make the United States look weak. Now go on to the dissat. First, case outweighs. None of their impacts reach total planetary extinction. Second, the plan solves. Lifting the embargo would usher in democracy. That's our Mosh evidence. It says that economic diversification and economic growth is a cause of democracy. That means the plan is a prerequisite to their impact. 3. Cuban democracy is not emerging now. Associated Press in 12. Elections lack hoopla, but authorities say they give people a voice in government. Critics call them a sham. The government says high turnouts are a sign of support for the revolution. Dissidents say people vote for fear. There's no real electoral threat to the country's rulers. Cuban authorities say they have no plans to change the system. 4. Non-unique. Their evidence is citing a blogger that holds no political weight. The only warrant for why democracy is happening in Cuba now is because of lessened internet restrictions, but they do not have a card that says lessened internet restrictions equals democracy. 5. No link. The plan will not change the motives of organic democratic groups. If those groups are invested in bringing democracy in Cuba now, there's no reason the plan would reverse that. 6. Link turn. Lifting embargo would empower democratic groups. Bandow in 12. Ending the embargo would have economic benefits. Expanding opportunities might increase pressure. Far the regime has taken small steps but rejected change. More contact would have an impact. Lifting sanctions would be a victory. Engagement is the best way to encourage these societies. Lifting the embargo would have a greater likelihood of success. 7. No internal link. They do not have a card that says countries would model the Cuban cooperative economic democracy. If it's true that they would, there's no reason that the Cuban model is key. Their own evidence cites the fact that Spanish cooperatives are already emerging. That would solve their impact. 8. No impact. Their turnable impact evidence cites multiple other initiatives that would need to be adopted globally to spur economic democracies worldwide, such as income security for all people. There's no way that this results in that. 9. Degrowth will fail, and environmental management is possible under the current system. Vanderberg in 11. Degrowth proponents seem to think that we cannot expect too much. Because policies are ineffective, their political acceptance is very low. The first is not convincing. We know from empirical research that people are sensitive to prices. We have made progress on scientific research and political awareness. It is too early to say that agreements and policy do not work, and that we need to turn to some degrowth strategy instead. The political acceptability of the latter is likely to be much lower than national policies, since a degrowth strategy will make income losses for everyone more visible and more explicit. Cross-examination.
Okay, let's talk about the first piece of evidence we read on the dissent. The Associated Press evidence has 0 qualifications. Why should we give this evidence anyway?
Well, first of all, I would beg to differ that Associated Press is completely unqualified. It is a well-established newspaper service that does provide valuable information regarding what's going on around in the world. And this evidence cites what is going on in the ground in on the ground in Cuba right now. It's saying that these elections do not have any credibility,
it's talking
and
about
elections are essential to make a democracy emerge.
It's talking about how the past election didn't lead to a democracy and they didn't vote the communists out. Why does that mean that in the future that democratic revolution will not be successful?
Sure, there is a possibility that theoretically maybe an election could result in changing the way that political establishments are working there. However, this evidence denies or sheds light on the fact that that may not be true due to the fact that the last elections did not result in something similar.
Okay.
Also, that begs the question of how good your own uniqueness evidence is, and it says that
pretty sure
there is not much changing
turn
between those elections and what's happening now.
Okay, the Bandow evidence on the link turn is talking about economic benefits. Why does that have anything to do with a successful democracy?
Quote, lifting sanctions would be a victory. Engagement is the best way to encourage these societies, and it would make a democracy a greater likelihood of success. It would be a victory.
A victory for what?
For the power of free people to spread liberty. And I didn't highlight that part, but I read it now, so it counts. But, what was your question, sorry?
Why does that mean that there will be a democratic form of government, or that we will have the right type of economic model? It just has economic benefits in a vague term.
Well, the link between some sort of democracy sprouting up in Cuba and that resulting in these worker cooperatives that your impact evidence is talking about is your own internal link.
Sure,
evidence.
but the Bandow evidence doesn't talk about these worker cooperatives. It just says economic
But the link
opportunities.
between
Why is
democracy
that
and worker
different?
cooperatives is your evidence.
I'm pretty sure
This
we've
is
made
just
a
making the
clear
argument.
distinction between a capitalist form and the worker cooperatives that we have now.
But your evidence says that if democracy were to emerge in Cuba, it would help foster these groups to occur, these worker cooperatives. Our plan, this link turn evidence says that the plan would help that democratic move in the direction that your internal link evidence is talking about. So this is a link turn argument.
Let's
and
talk
you're right,
about
it doesn't
your
say
case
the
arguments.
internal link argument.
For things like proliferation, why would a country have an incentive to use a weapon that is so self-destructive?
Would you like me to answer it? No, we're good.
Okay.
All right, let's talk about some things that went down in that 2AC. So this debate's getting interesting. First, let's talk about the order Julia went in addressing the various arguments. What did she put first, the off-case arguments or the case arguments? Case arguments. It is a great idea to put the case arguments first, because if you lose your case, you have lost everything. Let's think about it. If you answer all the case arguments and you drop the disadvantage, you could still maybe win that the case outweighs the disadvantage. So you got to prioritize that case first. You've already invested 8 minutes in the 1AC talking about it, so it'd be a shame to lose it because you put it in the bottom of your speech and didn't get to it in time. However, if you inverted the order, say you had 1 billion answers to the disadvantage, but didn't get to your case, you're probably still going to lose because you haven't extended any of your own offense, any of your own arguments. You have nothing to hang your hat on. Even if you prove the democracy isn't coming in Cuba, and the economic democracy is irrelevant, and the degrowth doesn't work, if you don't have any case left, then you're going to lose. So as a 2A, it's always good practice to make sure your case arguments, your 1AC arguments, are on the top of the debate, because that's where you want to prioritize and that's where you want to focus. That's what you want the debate to come down to, so you need to make very sure that you cover all of that, and I think Julia did a very good job doing that. The second thing, Julia's line by line on case, I thought was really easy to follow and really crisp. Did other folks have that experience?
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, it was really clear what argument she was answering, because she was being like on the 1NC number 1, on the 1NC number 2, because both sides are using this hard numbering and saying the actual numbers. It's much easier as a judge to follow than if you had to use some other argument reference. So I'm glad that everyone is using the actual numbering as opposed to just referencing things willy-nilly. And it was really cool and clear that, you know, she was making multiple arguments to every negative argument. A good debate, what will happen is it won't be one argument versus one argument versus one argument versus one argument. One team will introduce an argument, the other team will broaden that debate and make that debate deeper. Because she's already read 1AC evidence, she can now develop that evidence vis-a-vis some of the case arguments. So she won't just make one answer to a negative case argument, she might make 3 or 4 in an attempt to make that debate deeper, which I think was really well done. Another thing she did on case that I really liked was pointing out concessions. Pointing out concessions. Did people catch her doing this?
Yeah.
Well, so what did she point out was conceded by the negative?
Solvency.
Solvency for warming. Yeah, exactly. She said that they didn't make an argument that we didn't solve warming. What else did she point out was conceded? Other than solvency for warming.
Warming happening now.
Warming happening now. She said that that was conceded as well. They only made arguments that it was inevitable, or that it wasn't that bad, not that it wasn't happening. So you notice the negative didn't get up and say, well, we'll concede the terminal impact of this, and we'll concede the solvency for this. They didn't make any explicit move to do any of that. Rather, they were just silent on some issues. Good 2As and good debaters will pounce on that silence and say, that silence is agreement with our argument. So here are the parts of our argument that remain strong and remain unchallenged. And with those unchallenged parts of the argument, they'll build around that. They'll build the rest of their strategy around that. Something else I thought was really cool in the 2AC, what did she do with the soft power impact? She conceded it. She didn't continue going for it. She said, we'll concede their defense. I'm not going to go for this nigh evidence, this soft power impact. It's really smart for debaters to go for less arguments as time goes on, so you can get deeper on the arguments you do go for. If you just go for every argument throughout the entire debate, then every argument remains surface level. You get horizontal width of the debate, but you don't get any depth on issues. And like I was saying in the lecture this morning, what makes judges happier than anything else is if you're very deep on a few issues by the end of the debate, as opposed to being really shallow on a lot of issues. So everyone should have 4 sheets of paper right now, still, at this point. And, you know, right now, just take a minute and think about what you think you would do if you were the 2NC in this situation. How would you, if you were the negative team, divide up this block? Take a minute to think about it, and then I might ask some people what they might do. And we'll see what Jason does. Jason and Paula have already talked about how they're going to divide up the block, so think about it. Alright, somebody want to give me a stab at how they would, if they were the 2NC, divide up this block? Yeah.
I feel like I would go, because like they spent like most of the time talking about like democracy and relations. So I was feeling like the first part of the block would be like, like relations and democracy, and the second part would just be like counterplan and human rights.
You put the counterplan and human rights in the 1 and R maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? What would you do?
I'd do the opposite. I'd put, because the 2NC is longer, I'd put the dissent and the counterplan there because I want to get more in depth about it. So like it outweighs the case. And as for the 1 and R, I keep all case on that.
Okay. Yeah, that's another option. Yeah.
I would do D8 and case in the 2NC and then counterplan in the 1 and R.
Ooh, big lots of counterplan in the 1R. You're banking on that counterplan to do some work. I like that. Yes.
I do CP and case in the 2NC and then the dissent in the 1R.
Why?
Because they need more time because they spend a lot of time on the dissent. So the 1 and R has that amount, time to prep, so they can get good answers to the dissent. And I feel like it would case would be like a better. There would be options in both speeches if there was case.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The 1 and R has a big advantage because the 1 and R gets more prep time than any other speech in debate world. The 1 and R gets 3 minutes of cross-examination, plus 8 minutes of speech time, plus whatever speech time the 2NC takes. So the 1 and R has a minimum of 11 minutes of preparation time, and likely more preparation time. So given that this disad is sort of central to their strategy, it's their biggest, best offensive weapon, maybe it might be smart to put that in the 1 and R, because Paula will have more prep time to think about it and talk about it. On the other side of the coin, maybe Jason will go for it in the 2NC. It depends on what he's wanting or what he'd like to do. Are you ready to go, Jason? All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see who's right. There is no real right answer, but I think it's just interesting to see how different people would do it, because there are a lot of options.
The order is going to be the counterplan, the human rights advantage, and then the Latin America relations advantage.
Ooh, our last answer was the winner.
You won't. I've already got like Steve Wills punching out of Is everybody ready?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Counterplan. I'm not going for it. Permutation is just a test of competition, However, this does not mean that it's not relevant. The fact that the affirmative does not close Guantanamo Bay is an alt cause to their ability to solve human rights and relations with Cuba. Our Perez evidence, which is a solvency advocate for the 1AC, indicates that you must close Guantanamo Bay in order to no longer violate their sovereignty. If you don't do that, then it will be impossible to have good Latin American relations. Now the human rights advantage flow. Extend 1 and C1 are Perez evidence. If you lift the embargo too quickly, you open up their market too quickly, and the government would not be able to control the transition, causing economic collapse and political instability in Cuba. This argument is very important and an additional link to the disadvantage, because she said in the 2AC that economic growth in Cuba is necessary for a democratic transition. If we win, that you disrupt growth in Cuba because you make their economy operate too quickly and cause instability, they will never achieve democratic status, and we will never lift the embargo, and it's another link to the impact listed on the disadvantage. Now, you don't solve human rights. Extend our Greenwald evidence. Lifting the embargo does not prevent human rights abuses globally in places like Russia, China, or even prevent United States policies like the war on terror, indefinite detention of terrorist suspects, drone striking U.S. citizens. All of these are human rights abuses which will continue in the future despite the affirmative's best attempts to show that the United States is committed to human rights. Now, we do have impact defense to this argument. Human rights abuses have happened in the past. They will happen in the future. It's sad, but the affirmative cannot solve it, and it is a fallacy for them to pretend to do so. Also, the fact that human rights abuses have been going on for all of human history prove that it is yet to cause extinction, because there are still 7 billion people on the planet flourishing despite human rights abuses. Now, they need an explanation of when, how, and why it will lead to extinction, and how the affirmative is able to prevent every single one of those scenarios just by lifting the Cuban embargo. I think that will be a tough time for the 1AR. Relations. The affirmative cannot solve relations with Cuba or Latin America. They have competing political and economic views which make political relations incompatible. They're still locked in the Cold War mindset of they are communists. We will never cooperate with them. That's our Hansen and Lee evidence. And here's more alt causes to good relations with Cuba. Hamilton and Lee 13. What are the issues preventing normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations? Experts say these issues include human rights violations, Guantanamo Bay, the facility remains open, and Cuban exile community. Now, extend 1 and C2. There is no widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons. Proliferating states have dysfunctional management of nuclear programs due to weak political institutions. The quality of technical workmanship is low. There is no coordination among technical teams, and mistakes cause finger pointing and delays. That's our Hyman's evidence. Prefer it. First, it takes into account globalization, which has spread nuclear know-how and technology. Even though China has helped North Korea and Iran with their nuclear programs in the past, they are so incompetent that they are unable to even put together the bomb after China has helped them. They will not be able to do so in the future either. They make this accidents argument, but people have been predicting proliferation, breakout, and accidents for 50 years, and it's never happened. You should prefer empirics, which are objective and not tainted by ideology and fear-mongering. Now, empirics disprove future proliferation. Hyman's 12. Proliferation is dominating the news. Despite warnings since the 1970s, there has been a persistent slowdown. Proliferation slowdown is a result of dysfunctional management of states that have sought the bomb. Political leaders undermine the performance of their scientists. The nuclear technology and know-how diffuse. The timeline for building a bomb should have shrunk. But, rather than speeding up, proliferation has gone into slow motion. The average timeline has been 17 years. Now, extend 1 and C number 3. Warming is irreversible. Latin American relations will not solve. Our evidence cites a NOAA paper, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration within the United States federal government, which proved climate change is irreversible despite possible emissions cuts because there's still too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We would have to drop total global emissions to 0 right now in order to be able to reverse the catastrophic effects of climate change. Before you are like, oh, I'm voting AF for Latin American relations, ask yourself, what are they going to do to drop total global emissions to 0? Nothing. They might sign a treaty. That might get done. Has that worked in the past? The answer is no. It's not going to work in the future. The affirmative's recommendation is that relations could help the United States and Latin America, in their own words from 1AC Cross-Ex, do a bunch of stuff. But the do a bunch of stuff treaty is being held up by India, and it will not pass because they will continue to pollute the environment. So will China. They cannot persuade them to do otherwise. Here's more evidence on that question. Washington Times 11. Whether there's a heat wave or frigid winter, the cause is always global warming. If Mr. Gore were right, there's no solution to warming. Does anyone think China, India, or any power is ever going to alter its policies because of a flim-flam argument? Now, extend our 1C number 4 argument. Global warming does not cause extinction. They are exaggerated and rely on runaway warming, which doesn't exist. Warming is happening, but it's at a slow pace. Our Lomborg evidence cites scientific models, whereas the article evidence cites one person, and he's just a climate researcher for The Guardian and cites no official studies. Lomborg is immensely more qualified than that. Now, and when the worst effects of warming do happen, we'll just be able to adapt our political and economic institutions and be able to deal with it. It will not cause extinction. Now, extend the 1C number 6 argument. There's no impact to hegemony. She says that empirical evidence proves that the United States is responsible for lack of war in the past 6 years, but that's just not true. If there is a hegemonic decline, the United States can still shift burdens to allies and peacefully decrease our international commitments, and retain a strong military to deter adversaries and play a role in alliance formation. We can still do all of that without being the hegemon. The empirical record supports our argument. Transition periods are not more conflict prone. In fact, 83% of retrenchment cases, which are when hegemons decline in power, have led to peace rather than to war. Preferred evidence, it's the only comprehensive empirical study of retrenchment done to date. Preferred to their evidence from neocon spin machines like Robert Kagan, McDonald, and Parent 11. To date, there has been neither a comprehensive study of retrenchment. This article fills these gaps by examining 18 cases. Peaceful retrenchment is the most common response based on the empirical record. Great powers retrench 83% of the time. States renounce risky ties, draw down military obligations, and impose adjustments. Great powers facing decline are less likely to initiate or escalate militarized disputes. Great powers moderate their ambitions. Retrenchment neither requires aggression nor invites predation. Great powers rebalance commitments through compromise. And the only author they have to support this impact is Robert Kagan, and he's an idiot. Basevich Kagan. Kagan evinces no interest in data. Indicators of basic economic health do not figure in his analysis. For Kagan, the U.S. remains indispensable. Kagan refuses to acknowledge that U.S. expansionism has been counterproductive. Expansion served only to dissipate U.S. power. Expansionism no longer offers a way out.
Okay, so why does the fact that Russia or other countries might be engaging or hurting human rights mean that the affirmative doesn't resolve human rights?
Because the affirmative doesn't prevent them from committing human rights abuses, and your impact evidence says...
Which country do you have that says we don't prevent, that the plan wouldn't prevent us from Cuba committing human rights abuses?
Sure, you possibly might lead to less human rights abuses, or even no human rights abuses against Cubans. That's fine. Your evidence, unfortunately, indicates that if there are human rights abuses anywhere in the world, that will lead to extinction.
Your alternative causality card that you read says that one problem with our relationship with Cuba is human rights abuses. Can you explain the warrant to that argument for me, please?
It literally just lists them. It's human rights. We disagree with their record on human rights.
What's the warrant for that?
It means the United States disagrees and says, shame on you, Cuba, for their record on human rights, because they imprison political dissidents, which means we will not cooperate politically with them.
But your card does not say any of what you just editorialized on top of that.
Well, it says it afterwards, and since I'm paraphrasing the card, I can insert that because this is a speech.
If it's true that warming has been happening for a while and probably won't be able to be stopped no matter what, what is an example of something we could do to prevent warming? Is there anything we could do?
Cut all emissions.
So the world would have to cut all emissions ever to be able to prevent the environmental effects of warming, right? Okay, sounds good.
Sounds like the degrowth strategy of the disadvantage is a better one.
You got to win a modeling argument. When you extend the warming defense, you say that warming is occurring slowly. That's what your Lomborg card says. That seems to contradict the claim that your warming inevitable claim makes.
It's inevitable,
so how do you
but
resolve
it's also
that?
slow. It's inevitable, but also
But it's
slow.
not. But so it's not going to happen.
But also slow. And it's going to happen. It's inevitable, but it's going to
Okay,
get there over a really long time. 'cause it's
Your
slow.
Lomberg evidence. How is he qualified? That he is an economist. What scientific studies does he cite
Okay.
that says that it's actually going to happen?
Your evidence on this is from Oliver.
Your answer to the
Tickle.
question can't be your author is also unqualified. Defend yours, please.
Well, if yours is unqualified and mine's unqualified, then it's just bad evidence attacking each other, and
But
and
what's
that's okay.
the reason your evidence is qualified as per your 2&C was because he cites studies.
Yes.
What studies does he cite and where are they from?
I believe it's the NIPCC, which is the like the anti-IPCC organization.
What
So,
is that? Can you explain that to them, please? Because I don't think you know
Tickle
what it
cites
is
the
either.
IPCC, which was the International Panel on Climate Change. I cite the NIPCC, which is the You Are Lame.
You can repeat the abbreviation to
He's
me,
also the
but it
director of the
doesn't seem
Copenhagen Consensus
Yeah,
Center and
an
adjunct
economist.
professor
Thank
at
you.
Copenhagen Business School. I'll take Bjorn over Oliver any day.
Bjorn Lomberg versus Oliver Tickle, a battle of titans. All right. Lots of good stuff happening in that 2&C. Lots of case defense happening in that 2&C, primarily. Let's first talk about the counterplan. What happened to the counterplan?
He kicked it.
He kicked it. He was like, you know what? We don't need this counterplan. It probably doesn't resolve a whole lot, so I'm not going to go for it anymore. And that's a smart decision. In the negative block, you never, ever, ever, ever want to go for everything that was in the 1NC. You never want to go for everything that was in the 1NC. The reason for that is that the negative block is the only advantage the negative has in the debate. The affirmative speaks first and last, which is a huge advantage. They set the terms of the debate. They're the last ones to talk. They can choose what the most important arguments are at the end of the debate. It's a really big advantage. And that makes the 2NR really, really hard, because the 2NR has to both answer all of the 1AR arguments and preempt all of the 2AR arguments. That's a really hard speech. The way the negative can deal with that, and the advantage that they have, is by putting pressure on the 1AR. By making sure that they have deep arguments in the 2NC or in the block. They need to have a lot of explanation on fewer arguments in order to enable the 2NR to use that explanation to be able to beat both 1AR arguments and 2AR arguments. It's only depth that allows you to do that. If he extended everything, he might not have had time to be as in-depth about each argument he went for. They might be a little more surface level, and that makes B and F a little bit easier. So kicking out of things in the block is always a good idea. You should always try to consolidate the debate to fewer issues. Judges prefer that too, because it's easier to judge a debate that's about less things, because people tend to talk more about their arguments and do a little more comparison and things like that. I thought he did something else with the counterplan that was pretty cool. Did anyone pick up on this? Yeah.
Instead of saying just we're not going for it, it's gone, he said that yeah, we're not going to go for it, but it still applies. These parts of it still apply. He said that
Yeah, I think that explanation is pretty on point. He said we're not going to go for the counterplan, so we're not going to say the United States federal government ought to get rid of Guantanamo Bay. But he did say our evidence still says things are a real problem in Guantanamo Bay because Guantanamo Bay makes people angry and it's still a human rights issue. That's what the 1NC card said. That was the reason why the counterplan might be a good idea. So he used this as what he called an alt cause, or an alternate causality argument, to say that the affirmative can't solve relations or human rights, because if the counterplan was right initially, that Guantanamo Bay hurts our relations and hurts human rights, and they're not going for the counterplan, so Guantanamo Bay will still exist, then that will affect relations and human rights. Does that make sense? It's a pretty good example of using arguments even when you're not going for them to make useful and productive arguments for you. He's made a solvency argument about the act. A few other good things about that speech. Did anyone notice where Jason's eyes were? Up. He was looking at the audience and he was engaging with the audience. We'll talk a lot more on Monday during the persuasion lecture about the value of that, but I think it was a really good example of persuasive speaking. He was attempting to engage with you. He wasn't getting stuck in his flow or in his laptop, which is a habit a whole lot of young debaters have, is they just get stuck reading. He was speaking to you. He was trying to persuade you, and I think that's good, and that's something we should recognize. I also liked his choice of where to read evidence. He didn't read any evidence that said the same things the 1NC evidence said, and I think that's really important. He didn't read any evidence that was redundant. When you read evidence in the block, it needs to add something new or contribute something new. So he had new evidence about Kagan's qualifications to help him in that qualifications debate. That's really useful. He had new evidence that identified different alternate causalities for Latin American relations. I think that was really useful because that's a different argument. A lot of people have the bad habit of they'll just read 6 cards that say the same thing. Jason didn't fall into that trap. He only read evidence when he needed to. He used his evidence as a pogo stick and not a crutch. He was making things better and stronger. He wasn't leading them. Pogo stick and not a crutch. It makes sense. All right.
Wow.
Sick. So, a few other things. Jason's style of clash was a little bit different than Julia's style of clash in the 2AC. Julia was very explicit with her argument references. She was saying, they said this first argument, I say 1, 2, 3. Jason didn't bother going through each of Julia's 1, 2, 3s. Instead, he was still answering her arguments by and large. Maybe the 1AC or 1AR will disagree that he didn't answer some of the arguments, but he was doing it a lot via embedded clash. He was implicitly answering the arguments or making references to some of the words Julia used during her 2AC, which is one way to do stuff. One other thing that I liked about this speech is that not only, remember that cross-examination of the 1AC when he was asking Viva, how do you solve warming? And he made that quip about the we do some stuff treaty? That didn't just float there in that 1NC Cross-Ex. He put it into the speech. He used it. He kept that cross-examination alive and made that time he spent making Vivek trying to explain things and those quips he made into useful arguments. And he didn't have to spend as much time on that argument because he'd spent time explaining it in cross-examination. That's a really good example of making sure your cross-ex remains useful throughout the debate and applying it in the debate. I think that was really good. Something else that's also really important to note, and this is the last thing because I think Paula's ready to go, he didn't fight about the affirmative's concession of the soft power argument. Did he mention soft power at all?
No.
No, he did not. And this is a very important thing because too many times, young debaters especially, when the other team concedes an argument, they'll be like, they have conceded this argument. Baha! It has been conceded and we are victorious about this argument. Julia already said that. Julia agrees with that. You don't need to go there and then make a big deal out of extending answers to an argument that they haven't gone for. He realizes that that's no longer a part of the debate. That's not an argument the affirmative is advancing, and it's not an argument that's relevant anymore. So he doesn't waste time talking about it. A lot of times, particularly younger debaters or debaters without as much experience, you'll see people going to an advantage that was kicked out of or not even gone for, and then being like, we still have all these answers to this advantage, we're way ahead on it, and the other team will be like, we didn't go for that. That's not our argument anymore. We've changed what? And they'll be kind of confused by that. So keep in mind that the debate, he's not just answering the 1AC anymore. He's answering the way Julia developed the 1AC into the 2AC. The 1AC has changed. It no longer has that soft power impact. So now he's not responding to those original arguments. He's responding to the way they were cast and used in the 2AC, which means he's being responsive to what the affirmative is actually doing. He's making sure he has that clash that judges so love and that is at the heart of good debate. All right, what is Paula going to talk about in the 1R? The dissent. Yes, almost certainly. Jason talked about everything else. And so if Paula was talking about any of the case arguments, that would be terribly redundant and not very useful. So you're probably going to need your dissent flow. You're probably going to need to have it ready because she's going to talk about it a lot.
Okay, so the order is just the dissent. Everybody
We
ready?
need prep.
Remember when I said this morning, don't make jokes if you're not funny?
Okay. The dissent outweighs and turns the case. Extinction is inevitable without degrowth. They have made a big mistake conceding the impact of the dissent. Environmental degradation like ozone depletion, biodiversity, and limited resources will lead to extinction. Resource wars will escalate due to desperation. Only degrowth can solve. You should prefer all of our impacts. They're already beginning to happen now. Degrowth is the only way to solve. Now it turns relations. Instability in Cuba is inevitable with the Castro regime in power. It means stable relations can never be achieved to solve things like warming and prolif. It also solves warming. Degrowth decreases things like resource consumption, which means that we would decrease CO2 emission. It also turns prolif. Resource wars would incentivize countries to proliferate to win those wars. And it turns human rights. Democratic revolutions are more likely to decrease human rights abuses. Now, at worst, it solves the affirmative. Status quo results in a democratic revolution, which means in the future we will remove the embargo. The only reason we have an embargo now is because they are a communist dictatorship. That means that the dissent solves the app. Now, the second argument that the plan solves, subpoint A, it's not talking about worker cooperatives. That's our key internal link. That means that they cannot solve degrowth. Subpoint B, it's not a prerequisite to solving. Our uniqueness evidence indicates that the status quo is leading to a transition to democracy. Subpoint C, easing travel restrictions disprove that the affirmative would solve. That's Basillo in 2013. There are many who argue that the best way to spread democracy is by lifting the embargo. However, this is erroneous. Due to the fractured and weakened state of the embargo, travelers visited Cuba. This influx has not resulted in an influx of democratic ideals. With the death of Chavez, Maduro only won by a narrow margin and will be forced to cut spending. Therefore, now is the ideal time to take action. Without Venezuela's support, the Cuban government will assuredly face an economic crisis. Strengthening the embargo would place further pressure on the Cuban government. A change in the Cuban political climate is within reach. Now, off of 2AC number 3, subpoint A, extend our Redoche 2013 evidence from the 1NC. Cuban democracy is coming now. The breaching of government bans proves. Prefer our evidence because it postdates theirs by an entire year. Subpoint B, Cuban opposition movement is strong. Chavez's death proves. That's Simone and Ontiero in 2013. Chavez's passing will affect developments in Cuba. It is a reminder to the Castro brothers that power is ephemeral. The opposition movement is gaining voice. They are increasingly self-confident. Sanchez stepped into place. Cuba is ripe for change. Now, subpoint C, prefer evidence. It's from the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations. Theirs is from the Associated Press and has 0 qualifications. Now, off of 2AC number 4, yes, our evidence is from a blogger, but it is an example of breaching government bans. Our Redoche evidence indicates that this type of bottom-up approach is key to have a democracy in the future. Now, off of 2AC number 5, they have misunderstood our argument. Lifting an embargo empowers the government, which makes the groups ineffective. That means that no democratic revolution will occur. Our argument is not that the interest groups will change their minds, so this argument is irrelevant. Now, off of 2AC number 6, you should cross-apply the answers from 2AC number 2 because they are all just as relevant. And U.S. actions do not spur things like democratic changes. That's empirically proven. It would most likely lead to things like blowback. Now, off of 2AC number 7, the modeling argument. First of all, our evidence indicates that countries are looking at Cuba to be successful before they begin to model. Cuba is the symbol. Subpoint B, you should prefer our evidence since they have read none. Subpoint C, Spain is not sufficient. We have to prove that this model is effective in different regions, and Cuba is a key platform. Now, on 2AC number 8, our Turnbull evidence indicates that Cuba is a starting point. Subpoint B, no argument the plan solves things like income security. It means that it's try or die for the dissent. Now the degrowth arguments, which is 2AC number 9. Subpoint A, degrowth solved. It says that worker cooperation model is able to make employers more accountable. Now B, prefer our evidence that is specific to Cuba versus their generic evidence. Subpoint C, degrowth is critical to prevent extinction through environmental collapse. That's IPS in 2012. With the planet's resources stretched to the limit, action is needed. This intentional societal shifting is essential for a world where 7 billion humans are depleting Earth's biocapacity and threatening the collapse of key ecosystem services. Instead of degrowth, we'll have an uncontrollable global contraction that will lead to more discomfort and human suffering than degrowth ever would. Now, the DISAD is able to solve this degrowth will spread globally. That's Boyle in 2012. The Cuban experience is promising an example of degrowth.
All right, while Vivek prepares his 1AR, some thoughts on that 1R. That was a very technical speech. Now, what do I mean by a very technical speech? She had to get through a lot of arguments, and in getting through a lot of arguments, she made a lot of arguments, right? On each answer that she was making, she had subpoints to everything. She was making sure she had multiple levels of argument against every 2AC argument. She was increasing the depth of the debate for every 2AC argument, which is really strong for the negative and puts a lot of pressure on the 1AR. Some other thoughts about this speech. Some people might have had a little bit of trouble flowing some of that. That's okay. Hopefully you did your best in trying to get all of those arguments down. Because I think that was very organized and pretty efficient too. So, other things that were good about that speech. What did she do at the top of her extension of the DISAD?
Overview.
An overview. Yes, she did what we call impact calculus. Now on Monday, the lovely Stephen Wheel will be giving a lecture on impact calculus. When we have impact calculus and persuasion day for lecture time, get excited. But that impact calculus was really good, I think, for a lot of reasons. You notice when we were discussing earlier, or this morning when I was talking about how judges love clash and judges love debaters who resolve things for them, you notice she wasn't content to say our DISAD has an impact. She wasn't content to say degrowth is important, because she anticipated what the affirmative response to that would be. The affirmative response would of course be, well, human rights are also important, and Latin American relations are also important. So as opposed to being just saying degrowth is important on its own terms, and saying worker cooperatives are important on their own terms, she used that worker cooperatives and degrowth impact argument to interact with or deal with some of the affirmative's advantage claims in order to make sure her DISAD, if they won it, could mess up some of the things the app says. Let's talk about what some of those arguments were. She said that if they won the impact, it turns the Latin American relations argument. Did anyone catch the reason why it turned Latin American relations? Yeah.
Because democratic elections would actually solve the human rights.
Right. Well, that I think was the human rights argument, which she did say it turned that too. The relations argument was similar, though. It was that if there was a democratic Cuba, we would obviously have better relations with it, because that's the reason the embargo exists in the first place, because they're anti-democratic. So if democratic momentum happens, you heard her say the phrase, then the DISAD would solve the case. Basically, she's made an argument that if they're right about their uniqueness claim for the DISAD, which is that democracy is coming now, then the affirmative is irrelevant, because if democracy comes in Cuba, the embargo would go away. Or we wouldn't need an embargo, or we'd have better relations with Cuba anyway. She's made the argument that the DISAD solves the case. She said it solves warming, too. She says it turns their proliferation argument. She said it turned their human rights argument. She said it turned their relations argument. There was not an argument that the affirmative still had alive in the 2AC that she did not try to say that the DISAD interacted with in some way. And I think that's a really important thing to do with your disadvantages, because that's actually impact calculus. That's actually impact comparison. That's talking about why you have access to their arguments. That's an attempt to resolve things for the judge. When you're determining which of these is more important, as opposed to just stacking up bodies, you can say which access is which is a prior issue, which is actually more important for us to deal with in the context of each other. So I think that was good. There was a lot of very good impact calculus on the top. And there was a lot of 2AC answers, so at times she had to be pretty efficient in getting through that speech. So you notice sometimes in arguments that were less threatening, she spent a little less time on them and relied on some of the 1NC evidence. For arguments she thought were more threatening, she spent a little more time and maybe even read a card or two. And I think that was good. Now, for the 1AR, upcoming, we talked this morning about putting yourself in a debater's shoes. Should the 1AR extend every 2AC argument? No, absolutely not. If the 1AR extends every 2AC argument, the affirmative will probably lose. The affirmative will probably lose because the block just spent 13 minutes answering every 2AC argument. If the 1AR extended every 2AC argument in 5 minutes, that would be giving them 5 minutes to answer 13 minutes of arguments. And you're just not going to win if you do that. However, if you pick and choose some of the 2AC arguments to extend, maybe a few arguments on the disad, maybe a few arguments on each case advantage. Well, you have to defend your case, but choosing only a few arguments on the disad, maybe kicking out of some other case impacts, then you get some time back. Because then you're not answering all 15 minutes in the 1AR. So say Viveth only extends 2 or 3 arguments on the disad. As opposed to dealing with 5 minutes of the 1R, he's then maybe only dealing with 2 minutes of the 1R, or 3 minutes of the 1R. And that makes his job a lot easier. That also focuses the debate. That consolidates the debate. So before Viveth starts talking, I'd like everyone to take a minute, look at their disad flow. Let's put ourselves in Viveth's shoes. I'd like you to circle on your flow which arguments you think the 1AR should go for against the disad. What do you think a good 1AR strategy against this disad is? And we'll see which ones he ends up going for. There were how many 2AC arguments?
Like
9 or 10 2AC arguments? 9? Okay. So, you know, he might be going for how many? 3 or 4? 5-ish? 3 or 4?
7.
10?
Actually 15.
Hopefully not. Yeah. Alright, has everyone circled a few arguments? Alright, hopefully you're choosing arguments not just at random, or not just based off how much Paul has said about them, but based off how powerful those arguments are. You should be thinking about the strategy of those arguments. If I gave a 2AR on just those arguments, could I beat the disad? That's the question you should be asking yourself. And you want to consolidate down to a good strategy to beat this disad. And I'm sure Viveth will attempt to do that.
The order is human rights, relations, the counter plan, then the disad. Everybody ready? The negative block conceded the terminal impact to the advantage. It's not about how we understand nuclear war, but rather how we deal with people. People in Cuba do not have sufficient medical technology. They do not have water treatment facilities, and the plan enables them to get that by lifting the embargo. The first 2NC argument does not answer anything. The embargo does not develop the market too fast. The market still develops slowly, but the plan enables the growth and diffusion of technology, which solves the advantage, but does not link to this argument. There's also no terminal impact to this argument, which means that there's no reason it should be considered anyway. Second is that though we do not solve all human rights abuses possible, this does not matter in the context of this disadvantage because it's about how we treat people in Cuba. If we refuse to do anything, then we will never do anything in the future. It's like saying that racism is inevitable, so we shouldn't do things that aren't racist. It's an argument about why you should take action. Secondly is that he's conceded from the 1AC Cross-Ex that there is a consciousness shift when we understand people differently, so we don't think of them as dirty communists anymore, but allow us to interact with them on a different level by lifting the embargo. Relations advantage. Yes, there is a Cold War mindset in the status quo, but it is filtered through economic engagement. The way that we understand them is through the embargo. By lifting the embargo, we can have sustainable relations with Cuba. Our evidence indicates that it is a litmus test for relations with overall Latin America, which means the plan solves. Yes, there is proliferation, which answers the next 2NC argument. Russia and China means that tech diffusion is possible. That's our Horowitz evidence. Second is that the people can put together the bomb very easily. People, for example, North Korea has the missiles necessary. Our argument is that Latin American relations are necessary to stop people like Venezuela from getting the bomb. And the new nuclear deal with China, with Russia, already means that they're trying to get nuclear technology. Yes, there's accidental war because of a hair trigger conflict, which means that there's more likely to be conflict because people have their systems on high alert, which means that in the event of a first strike, they would want to respond with nuclear weapons. You should err on the side of caution. Do not risk other countries getting the nuclear bomb, even if it might not cause extinction. There is more of a chance that wars would escalate if everyone had nukes. Now, the last argument I will be very explicit about. We will concede that warming is irreversible unless there are no carbon cuts. Jason is also very persuasive that the incentives for growth means that China and India are more likely to pollute the atmosphere, which links to all of their impact arguments on the DA. If it's true that China and India will do things like pollute water or release CO2 emissions, those would also collapse the ozone. This means that if warming is inevitable, like the 2NC made, then it means that they cannot solve warming. We will concede that warming is irreversible. The impact to the environment no longer exists. The hegemony defense doesn't get them anywhere. World War I and World War II prove that power transitions are more likely to cause conflicts, and burden shifting fails because there is a power vacuum created when the U.S. is not at the center in unipolarity because of China's rise, which proves our arguments. Counterpoint. The AF still solves everything. Our arguments are not about the violation of sovereignty, but about economics. Economics are the filter through which we understand relations with Latin America and relations with Cuba. And the embargo acts as a litmus test for all other ways that we interact with Latin America. Second is we still solve human rights. Our impacts are about access to water, access to medical supplies, which has nothing to do with Guantanamo Bay, the DISAD. Extinction is not inevitable. If we win any defense to the ability for degrowth to solve, it should conjunctively also act as defense to the extinction impact. Degrowth does not do anything to solve global warming, but that'll be explained later. They do not turn our relations impact. It is about economic cooperation, which the DISAD cannot do. Only lifting the embargo solves. They cannot turn pro-lit because it's about cooperation, with shifting Latin American countries from using nuclear power for weaponized uses. It does not turn human rights because economic cooperation is necessary to tech diffusion, which was explained before. You also cannot remove the embargo by democratic coalitions in Cuba because the U.S. has to change the embargo policy. Cuba obviously has no say in that. Now, they cannot, there's no democratic movement in the status quo. One bottoms-up approach is all that exists. It's one blogger. That's not democracy coming. It's one dude talking against the government. There's no evidence that that one guy is able to change all of Cuba. Our evidence indicates that no elections will be held. Those elections will not be able to change the regime, which means that even if this blogger speaks up against the government, nothing will happen. There is zero internal link to the DISAD. First is that Cuba is not modeled. No country is looking towards Cuba for their economic policies. Second is that their evidence about collective degrowth says that either Spain should have been able to solve that because they already have a collective worker guild, or that they would not model Cuba because no one is looking towards a successful policy. Finally, is that degrowth fails because there's no political acceptance of degrowth. Second is that people are sensitive to prices. Third is that we have technology and political will, which means only state-based approaches can do anything. If they cannot affect the way that every other state thinks about the economy, then they cannot change anything.
Woo, shucky. All right. It was a very solid 1AR. I think there were a few things that were good about that 1AR. The first, like Jason's 2NC, I think there was a lot of great eye contact. He was looking up, he was being persuasive, especially when he was talking about human rights, about how it's an ethical issue and something we have to act even if we can't solve all of it. I thought that was a really good persuasive moment for the 1AR, and I think that was good. I also liked how on that human rights advantage, you notice how he didn't explicitly go to every 2NC argument. He kind of grouped all of the arguments and then sidestepped them. He said, oh, you have all of these arguments about how there'll still be human rights abuses and still other bad stuff happening. Well, that's not relevant because we still make things a little bit better. He was able to kind of brush some of those arguments aside, which I think was good. I also like the fact that he used his cross-examination arguments there would be a mindset shift to bolster his solvency for those claims. So I think that grouping and that form of clash was pretty efficient by this 1AR. I think, what did he do with the warming arguments? Conceded them. What did he concede them in order to say? That they can't solve warming. Yes, he conceded the negative arguments that the affirmative couldn't solve warming because warming was inevitable, to take out the negatives arguments that degrowth was necessary to help the environment. He made some clever arguments here. He said that, the warrants to their evidence, or that there's always an economic incentive, that India and China will not change. They said that in Cross-Ex. He was being very careful to quote things that Jason and Paul had said in speeches in an attempt to demonstrate that they had made contradictory arguments. That they had both said we need a degrowth strategy to change the world's mindset about economics and solve for the environment and solve for the ozone and solve for global warming. But he made the argument they said that, and they've also said that it's impossible to solve for those things because of profit incentives, because it's inevitable. All 4 times in Cross-Ex, Jason was like, it's slow and it's also inevitable. Vivek turned that and tried to use it against him while kicking out of part of the 1AC advantage. So this is another example, like Jason kicking out of the counterplan and using those arguments. This is another example of consolidating the debate. The 2AR will no longer be going for that warming impact, but the 2AR now has some of those warming arguments to use against the disadvantage. I think that was really smart, really clever by Vivek, and it's becoming a complex back and forth 2-sided debate, which I really like. So what impacts can Julia go for in the 2AR based off this 1AR? Human rights. Is there anything else? Prolif? Yeah. Probably human rights or prolif are the 2 advantages that they're still going for. And hegemony. I guess you extended hedge too, right? Yeah. Human rights, prolif, and hegemony. They're no longer going for the soft power impact. They're no longer going for the global warming impact. So they've consolidated down. They've focused the debate in order to spend more time developing the few arguments that they're going for, which I think is really well done. Something else that's incredibly important that this 1AR did. When he got to the disadvantage, did he just jump straight to the line-by-line arguments that the 2AC made? No, he did not. He spent almost 30 seconds answering all of Paula's impact calculus arguments. All of those reasons she said why the disad turned the case, why the disad would, mess up the affirmative's ability to solve, or why if the disad was true, it meant the affirmative was unnecessary. He spent a lot of time making sure he dealt with all of those arguments because he realized that if they win any of those arguments, those can be silver bullets. Those can be really bad for the affirmative. So he made sure to try to deal with all of those. How many arguments did he extend on the disad itself? 4? 3? All in favor of 4? All in favor of 3? What do you think it was?
I think it's 3.
Think it was 3? Stephen, check, it was 3. He made a couple warrants to some of those different arguments, but you notice he really did consolidate. Were those arguments some of the arguments that you all were thinking of that might have been points of weakness? Yeah, I think there's kind of an intuitive weakness of this disad, which is that even if this economic model is good, is everyone else going to change the way they do their economy because Cuba did? I don't know. The negative certainly thinks so. The affirmative certainly doesn't. But his decision to focus more of his arguments there was, I think, a good one, because at least perceptually, that might be a weakness of this disadvantage. So I think he's doing well to focus down on those things. Doesn't drop the impact calculus, etc. Now, we've had a theme throughout this debate of people going for less and less and spending more and more time talking about it throughout the debate. So, I think it's very likely that Jason will continue to extend this disadvantage. I think he probably needs to extend this disadvantage because they don't really have any other offensive arguments against the AF. They have a lot of reasons why the AF might not be good, or might not be as good as they say it is, but the democracy disadvantage is really the only reason why the AF might be bad, why the AF might make things worse, which is why, it's a big offensive position. That's why it was in the 1R. That's why they spent so much time developing it. It's because it's really strategically important for them. So Jason will probably start his 2-1R with that, and then move on to some case arguments. Should he extend every case argument he extended in the 2NC? No, he should not. Same thing as before. If he extends less case arguments and spends more time talking about them, he puts more pressure on the 2AR because he actually has well-explained arguments and deep arguments. Debate and final rebuttals are almost entirely about choosing, about consolidating and choosing which arguments you want to go for. And so you should think to yourself and take a minute and circle on your flow whether or not you were right about the arguments he extended in the 1AR. Maybe you could be right about the case arguments that Jason will extend in the 2NC, or in the 2NR. So take a moment, circle the case arguments you think are the best, you think are the most persuasive, you think he's going to extend. He needs arguments that deal with those three different impacts. He can try to deal with them on multiple different levels. He can try to say the affirmative doesn't solve them. He can try to say they're inevitable. He can try to say that disad turns them. But he needs to deal with those three impacts, circle some arguments, think about how you would do it, and we'll see how Jason does it. You ready? Yeah.
So the order is going to be the disadvantage, the relations advantage flow, and the human rights flow. Okay. Is everybody ready? Cool. Degrowth is necessary to prevent extinction. It's try or die for the negative. They have sadly conceded that our argument is not just about warming. It is about resource wars. Endless consumption will cause a scarcity of resources such as food, water, precious metals that people will go to war over. The goal at the end of the debate is to prevent this outcome. Nuclear war is the worst possible outcome. Before you decide, imagine yourself huddled in the bunker of a basement with your loved ones, your pets, your goldfish, your gerbil, your dog. All of them will be taken from you in a nuclear hellfire that will irradiate the rest of the population who will wish that they had died in the initial explosion. You must prevent this outcome. No, do not focus on human rights. Do not focus on relations. Those things can be solved in the future. Unless, however, if there is a nuclear war that kills the entire members of every government, it really doesn't matter which humans are getting abused at that point because there will be no humans left. Now, they've conceded an argument that the status quo solves the case. If we win the fundamental uniqueness claim that democracy is coming in Cuba in the status quo because of bottom-up grassroots movements, the United States will consequently lift the embargo because their conditions for having it in the status quo are that they are a communist government. If they become a democracy, which we will win, will happen in the status quo unless the app happens, we will then lift the embargo. This will solve the entirety of the case in the future. Our argument is not that bottom-up grassroots movements will force the United States to lift the embargo. Our argument is that the United States will do it if they become a democracy, which will happen now. Seriously messed up that argument. Now, their first argument is that there is no democracy now. Our dash argument, yes, does cite a blogger, but it is a blogger that has been working on the ground in Cuba for the past 3 decades and is citing overall trends of bottom-up grassroots movements that want democracy in Cuba and are going to force the government to change. They're going to force the government's hands. Their AP evidence does not cite any on-the-ground movements in Cuba. They do not cite any Cuban reporters. You should probably prefer people who actually live there. That's also our dash evidence. It also postdates their evidence, which means it's taking into account current changes within the model of government. Now, they say Cuba is not a model. They are the last communist country that we are still embargoing because of the Cold War. That's our Dash and Harrison evidence. If they change to a democracy, other countries will see that it would be able to solve. If they can have a democratic economy, then that will prove that it is possible. It shows other countries that it can be done and will
incentivize them to adopt a degrowth strategy, which is necessary. The model set by Cuba proves that it is economical for you to adopt this strategy, which means they will. It would no longer violate economics. Either way, we only need to win 1% risk of this disadvantage because their case is so ungodly atrocious. Relations. Yeah, I said that. Extend that there's no impact to proliferation. They conceded our two piece of Hyman's evidence that indicates even through technological globalization and technology and information sharing, the scientists of these countries are too stupid to build the bomb. They won't be able to do so even if China is helping them along the way. This is empirically proven by the past 60 years, which disprove their fear-mongering. You do not need to err on the side of caution because they are too dumb. Now, the argument about warming irreversible taking out our impact, first, they conceded our Lomborg evidence that indicates it's slow. It's going to take place over a long period of time. It's not going to dry up all of the resources. It said it might hurt the environment, but not that it will hurt the environment. Our ROM evidence also says that if we cut emissions to zero, which is what the degrowth strategy plans on doing, then that will be able to solve. They try and concede this argument. You try and be tricky. It didn't work. Hegemony argument. They've conceded the McDonald and Parent evidence, which cites empirics from the last 200 years in the international system and indicates that in 83% of cases of hegemonic retrenchment or decline, it has led to peace. They've also conceded that their only support for this argument comes from Robert Kagan, who is a moron. That's our Basevich evidence, who actually is qualified. You should prefer our McDonald and Parent evidence because they are professors of international relations and they have actually studied this. Now, human rights flow. This is really the only chance they have of winning the debate. However, they will not solve human rights. There is no consciousness shift. Imagine the end of the Cold War, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. Those events were a lot more significant and did not cause everybody to love everybody else. The capitalists did not start getting along with the communists. You do not have a single piece of evidence that says you lead to a mindset shift. Removing the Cuban embargo is not going to prevent any type of human rights abuses from happening in China, Russia, anywhere else in the world. They will still imprison political dissidents, which will still trigger the impact. It's sad. It's inevitable. You can't do anything about it. The only thing you can do something about is allow for Cuban democracy to flourish in the status quo unless you lift the embargo, which will harm their economy and prevent these movements from flourishing by just strengthening the elites there.
Cut those off yourself. Oh, yeah. Say, those used to be complete pants.
They did.
The first thing I'd like to note is not about that speech at all, but is about Ed's pants. They have evolved. He has cut off the bottom of them and thereby created shorts where pants once were. An incredible stylistic move by Mr. Lee. Some observations that are actually relevant and about the speech. First, I think I really liked a lot of Jason's impact calculus at the top. He was bringing a lot of persuasive force and a lot of kind of fire and brimstone, old school preacher style to that. What did he say was going to happen if you voted affirmative?
You'd all be dead.
You and your whole family would die in a fire, yes.
Your gerbils and your dogs and your cats.
Gerbils and dogs and cats. And goldfish, yes. I don't know why your goldfish is in the bunker with you, but that was a very memorable moment of the speech, and it kind of stand out, and hopefully, maybe it made you feel a little something too. Some other things that I liked about that. You notice that he didn't just say that there would be some sort of nuclear war. He made arguments about what the things the affirmative was likely to win would mean even if they won them. He said that even if they win a human rights argument, it doesn't matter because most of the humans will be dead. Right? That argument is incredibly important because it doesn't fall into the trap of thinking that you will win every argument. Too many times, debaters fall into the trap of thinking, we're just going to win everything. Jason didn't fall into that trap. He realizes that they might win some of this human rights argument. And so he builds his impact calculus around that. Too many times debaters get up and they're just like, we're winning everything, we're crushing on this, and we're crushing on this, and we're crushing on this, and boosh, we got nuke wars, and I'm out. That's not a very effective 2-R because everyone is always going to win something. The affirmative will win some arguments. I'm sure when Julia gives her 2AR, she'll also indicate that the negative is probably going to win some arguments. The affirmative is likely to win some risk of their case. That's just the nature of debate. They started it, they built it, they read 8 minutes of cards about it in the 1AC. They're probably going to win some risk of that, unless they've done something horribly wrong. The negative is probably going to win some risk of their disadvantage. They spent 5 minutes extending in the block. They put it in the 1R. They spent all of that prep time. They spent all of that time thinking about it. They're probably going to win some chance of that disadvantage being true. So good impact calculus, like Jason was doing, takes that into account and says even if they win their arguments, it doesn't matter because our impact is more important. And I think that was really well done. He also had a statement in there that was, we don't need to win a large risk of the disadvantage to win the debate because it's a much bigger impact. Did everybody catch that?
1%.
He said even if we only win 1%. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, but it's still perhaps a useful rhetorical move because it's saying he knows that they're going to win some defense to the disadvantage. He knows that the affirmative is too good to just give them an entire disadvantage. And so he's saying, yeah, as a judge, you might be in a position where you think the risk of this disad has been substantially reduced, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still vote on it. Notice his whole impact calculus, the whole top of that 2NR, was basically instructions for the judge. What should you do if various scenarios take place in the debate? What should you do if you think we win the disad? What should you do even if you think we don't win all of the disad? He's not just making arguments and leaving them out there. He's instructing the judge as to what to do with them, how to think about them, etc. And so I think that was quite well done. Notice that he consolidated on the case arguments as well and was sure not to drop anything that the affirmative said. Or at least he tried not to drop any of the advantages. He only really went for one argument on the human rights advantage, spent almost 30 seconds on it. What was that one argument?
Wait.
Yeah.
They can never solve for the entirety of human rights.
That you can't solve the entirety of it because it's inevitable.
No mindset shift.
He realized that, they might have some game on that advantage, and so he spent a lot of time trying to develop that one argument and be really deep on it. Now, if you were Julia, and you were about to give this 2AR, again, let's put ourselves in the debater's shoes. What would you start with in your 2AR? What is your primary impact that you are going for? You should probably consolidate the debate down to just one, maybe two impacts. So is she going to go for hegemony? Is she going to go for the proliferation arguments? Or is she going to go for the human rights arguments as her primary offense? What would you do? Write it down, think about it. We'll see what Julia ends up doing. You need a little more time? Okay.
Okay. The order will be human rights, relations, and then the disadvantage. Are we doing a discussion with everyone, or are we talking about?
I think we should just do a night lab and then just skip on the rest of it.
The way you think.
And go deeper.
Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Right now, this very moment, Cubans are searching for clean water. They're dying because they're being deprived of valuable medical supplies. Then they are also scouring for food because the embargo is not allowing them to get access to critical goods. This is the only impact that is relevant in this debate because it is occurring right now. It has 100% probability, and the affirmative has a way to remedy this issue. It outweighs nuclear war because we need to prioritize this ethical issue. If we do not prioritize it above things like nuclear war, it will continue to be pushed aside and continue to be ignored. It is undeniable that these people are suffering under the vicious rule of the Cuban government. We have 100% probability and an ethical obligation to act. None of his impact defense is irrelevant. We have several examples throughout this debate. first, Vivith refers to how even if racism is occurring now, that's not a reason we should not address it. If 2 people are drowning and we only have the resources to save one, that's not a reason we shouldn't try to save one of them anyways. We would not let both of them drown. The negative would need to win that the affirmative makes the environment worse in order to win this debate. We also resolve 100% of human rights. He answers our consciousness shift argument, but fails to respond to the first internal link, that lifting the embargo changes the lens through which the United States and Cuba interact. It allows for the economies of the Cubans to be stimulated via injection of capital. The plan would be able to resolve the issues of lack of medical supplies. That's our Cole evidence and our Amash evidence. His reasons for why a consciousness shift would not occur get him in trouble here. The reason he cites is because it's not economically viable for other countries to change their relations between capitalists and communists. If that is the case, sorry you don't solve any of your impact, because there's no way that degrowth would spill over to other countries like China and India. He extends an alternative causality, but just because there are alternative causalities to our human rights credibility does not respond to the fact that people are dying in Cuba right now, and the affirmative resolves that. Alternative causalities are literally irrelevant here. Go on to relations. First, we will concede that there's no impact to proliferation. The only situation in which nuclear war would occur is via fast technology diffusion between countries that don't have nuclear weapons. That's his scenario. We concede impact defense, so there's no external nuclear war impact, which is his lovely beginning of his 2NR. No impact to that. Also, we will extend our warming inevitable arguments. They have conceded that we have conceded that warming is inevitable. It will happen no matter what we do. Their own arguments hurt them here. Their only impact card is explicitly referring to the environmental sustainability of the planet. The only situation in which the environmental sustainability of the planet would crash is a world in which we have global warming, which is going to happen no matter what. We've also conceded that China and India and all other industrial powerhouses will continue to pollute no matter what we do. If we stopped all emissions right now, it wouldn't do anything to save the planet. Their Lomberg evidence is just an indict of Tickle. Our Tickle evidence says that this would completely destroy the planet no matter what, and that the environment is screwed. And their own impact evidence is not about warming specifically. It's their China and India evidence refers to things like CFCs and other types of environmental degradation, which takes out the affirmative. Now I'm going to go to the dissad. You need to ask yourself, yes, good impact calculus, but what does the negative do about this? I'll go for one argument. They have conceded that degrowth fails and will never ever do anything. That was the 2NC number 9. It will never do anything because of price shifts and because of the lack of political will on behalf of other countries. Also, their own argument that China and India would never be able to adopt these. So they are not able to resolve the impact claims that they have presented. Also, go back to the top. They say the status quo would solve the affirmative. 2 arguments. First is they do not have a piece of evidence that if democracy emerged in Cuba, that would result in the lifting of the embargo. This is a laughable argument. Second is that democracy is not coming just because there have been bloggers that have been able to push back against the government. That doesn't prove that democracy is emerging. This doesn't make any sense. There's no internal link between breaking down internet and democracy becoming a flourishing economic system in Cuba. Also, they do not have a card that says that other countries would model. The fact that their own evidence on China and India on warming disprove this argument means that they have no way of resolving the impact claims they've talked about.
Julia consolidate to? 1, just 1, and she spent 2 whole minutes at the top of the 2AR talking about it. The 1AC had so many impacts, it had maybe 5 or 6. As of the 2AC, they got rid of soft power. As of the 1AR, they moved on from warming. As of the 2AR, they moved on to proliferation and hegemony as well. I think that was a really smart move by the affirmative to try to make sure they had a lot of depth on the arguments they were going for. And every time they conceded an argument, you notice they used it. They used the negatives defense to prove a point. She used the negatives proliferation arguments to say that, well, there wouldn't be proliferation, so there couldn't be the nuclear war that Jason said would kill your hamster. Right? Whatever, same thing. Your guinea pig, your weasel, your ferret, I don't care. It won't kill that rodent. Right?
Not nice.
Consolidated to that one impact. I think that was really well done. She had great impact, or great eye contact as she was talking about human rights. Also, a really nice thing to do because she has to be a little bit persuasive on that impact. It's not as big, it's not as nasty as a nuclear war, but it is highly probable and it is a more emotional issue perhaps. And so she tried to tap into that emotion to persuade you. There was great use of some of the kicking advantages to gain an advantage. I think that was good. I also like the fact that she only really went for like 1.5 arguments against the disad. 9 in the 2AC, 3 in the 1AR, really just 1.5, this no modeling argument and this no democracy now argument in the 2AR. Consolidated down, explained why those arguments mattered in the big picture. So really great impact calculus by both sides, and I think a really good debate that consolidated a lot. Now, for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I would like everyone to quietly and by themselves, you have to render your own decision. You may not ask the person next to you who they're voting for. I would like everyone to quietly and by themselves work out who you're going to vote for. Look over your flow. Do some thinking about the arguments. What persuaded you? What didn't? So think about who you're going to vote for and write your reasons for decision out. Should be reasons for decision that you would feel comfortable telling one of these debaters. If you voted against them, you should be able to explain to them very clearly why and what arguments were more persuasive. And this needs to be more than just like a one-sentence, I think human rights are a big deal, or nuke war bad kills hamster. This has to be a much more sophisticated and advanced reasons for decision based off the sophisticated and advanced interplay and interaction of arguments that happen in this debate. So spend 10 or 15 minutes quietly doing that, and then we'll talk about where we'll go from there.